So we're going to look at how to remote teach forensic toxicology in the current climate. Now, just to kind of put a little bit of context here about Anglia Ruskin Uni, we have 3 courses. We've got a Forensic Science BSc, a Crime and Investigative Studies BSc and a Forensic Science MSc. The Forensic Science and Crime and Investigative Studies BSc both share modules, so I work very, very closely with the course leader for the Crime and Investigative Studies course, Rebecca. She's fantastic. But I have been the course leader for Forensic Science now for just over 2 years, maybe 2.5, I think, I don't know. But I am the module leader, amongst other things, in other modules, but the module called Forensic Analysis of Drugs and Poisons. And this is a final year, final trimester module. So it fits in when they're doing their crime scene to court module and also when they're finishing their undergraduate projects. So this here is the kind of 2 key learning outcomes that relate to the forensic toxicology module that I lead on. So here we're asking students to demonstrate a high level of competency in the discussion of cases of death due to toxicological reasons. And we're also asking them to be able to critically assess the various methods of analysis when doing their interpretation. So basically what we're asking them to do in this module is to have an understanding of the actual analytical techniques that we use. We're asking them to know about what techniques to use when and what samples. They also have to show that they can actually handle some of the data. So what does all this different chromatographic data actually mean in mass spec? And then there's also the actual interpretation of those results. So in the context of the case, what do these concentrations that they have found, what do they actually mean? Now, I said that I had the kind of easy job here, and that's because my syllabus pre-COVID was actually already quite set up for going remote. So they did their kind of drug chemistry aspect in their practicals at the beginning of the trimester, whereas the toxicology falls in the latter part. So in week 7, what I used to do was I used to give them an SOP for the analysis of alcohol and for acetaminophen. And it would have kind of core information missing, such as concentrations or volumes that they would be putting in when they were creating their calibrators, etc. Right? So they would sit, and that what should take probably about half an hour takes about 2 hours for them to actually work through. I don't know what it is about taking something from being a nice normal little kind of lab manual protocol and putting it into an SOP that causes widespread panic, but it seems to do that. So that's a kind of, I guess, a tick from me. And then in week 8, I would give them ELISA results. So it would be a case of your samples have now been screened. Here are the ELISA results. So they would have been screened for like THC, for benzos, opiates, cocaine, etc. And then they had to interpret those ELISA results that they were provided to determine what confirmatory analysis they were going to do in week 9. And then they would have to submit a laboratory report in week 11 based on the case and what they found. Now, in week 11, they have a choice between whether they submit the drugs practical or whether they submit the toxicology practical, okay? And so to try and ensure that I get some people doing my practical, I would provide them the data. So we kind of used to make it into a competition to see which group would provide the right amount of data or the best kind of calibration curve, and that would be the data that I would put up onto their Canvas site. Now, what the students don't know, which some of them have found out since, and I love seeing their wee looks in their faces, is that they never actually handle any drugs. Because I'm actually giving them out the raw data at the end, it's actually the same data year on year out, and they don't actually ever handle anything. They only get methanol and water. So when they realise that and they've repeated parts of these SOPs multiple times, yeah, they find that quite, I guess, shocking. But there's no way in terms of a 2-hour practical session to really offer a full toxicological experience in terms of resources, it's really challenging. If you're trying to use something that's maybe going to be ran down on GCMS, you've got to add in derivatization time, incubation time, and these are all really lengthy steps. So when they hand their samples to me, for example, for derivatization, I just chuck them down the sink and put them in the oven so that it looks as if they have been incubated at a decent temperature when they come back. So yeah, it's all quite covert, but they get the raw data and then it's up to them to actually interpret what that data means. So if we look at the aspects that we're doing, we're trying to remotely teach them the different techniques that we get in forensic toxicology. And because I'm teaching at undergraduate level, things like solid phase extraction just isn't going to be feasible. Okay, master's level, yes, I would suggest that, you know, solid phase extraction should be covered then, because generally speaking, you've got kind of smaller cohorts. But trying to have vacuum manifolds and the cartridges, etc., becomes extremely cost intensive. And I don't know about the rest of you, but personally I find that, you know, we're a little bit underfunded. So that's not necessarily going to be suitable. So what we've been using quite heavily is Chrome Academy. So Chrome Academy provides really good virtual kind of simulations of how a lot of these chromatographic techniques actually work and how these sample extraction techniques work. And they're far better simulations than what I'm going to be able to put on a PowerPoint or on some sort of, you know, recorded lecture now. So what you can do is you can ask them as part of a portfolio to submit the assessments that go along with some of these modules. They can create free accounts, so it's not going to cost you anything. And again, you can build in that remote teaching of the techniques relatively easily, because it's about understanding what to use when, rather than actually how, you know, to use the actual software. You can also ask them to look at and to create drug monographs as well. So again, this allows them to go out and look at published literature that's out there. They get to see all the different new and wonderful drugs that we're getting. And it kind of, again, just gives them that little bit more of a kind of holistic approach to what they're looking at. And at the data as well that we're getting, and what instrumentation that we're using for different samples, etc. So this is a drug monograph from the Centre for Forensic Science and Research Excellence in the States. They've got, you know, hundreds of them. Swig Drug as well is full of lots of different drug monographs. So that's a kind of other alternative way of getting them to look at it as well. And then when it comes to the actual data handling aspect, okay, so teaching them how to use the instruments and things, I think that's relatively straightforward. And also, because this is a level 6 module, my students have already had a really quite intensive and large module called Forensic Analytical Chromatography or something, I don't know, FAC is what we call it. So they've already had that module. So they're already aware of a lot of this stuff, so we don't have to cover it that much in this forensic toxicology module. But what we do want them to be able to do is to actually handle the data itself. So what you can do is, if you are like me, and who has, you know, quite a really quite old GCMS that the students use, because it's a, you know, it's a workhorse, it's never actually, you know, broken down, it's fantastic. But our software is actually now so out of date that we went back and we contacted Shimadzu and said, can we virtualize this? And they said yes, but you know, you'll have to give us X amount of money to make it so that it's Windows 10 compatible. But they didn't have a problem with that, so we're in the process of doing that just now, which means that students will be able to be provided with actual raw data files rather than what I've previously been providing them, which is almost like a batch. So here is the data files and here are the peaks already extracted, etc. So you can do that, you can virtualize your own software, or you can provide them a batch for them to process. Or what you can do is you could kind of flip it and look at it as almost like a precognition trial. So where they're looking at a report for, you know, for example, like a defence lawyer, and they're trying to scrutinise that. So they're looking at the data from a defence point of view. And again, that's a kind of, I think, a level up in terms of being able to look at data and see what the data means and see whether it's how you would have handled and interpreted that data. If you can't virtualize your software or it's going to be too costly, there is an open source piece of software called Open Chrome. It is completely free to download, and it's really good if you're wanting to get your students to do qualitative data analysis. So it works for a huge range of GCMS and LCMS providers, and it will allow you to open your data files when you're not on campus, which is very useful. In terms of quantitative data analysis, though, it's quite difficult and it's quite cumbersome to use. It can be done, but I'm looking at mine for undergraduate students, and so you have to delete every single ion that you don't want to look at, as opposed to just select the one that you do. So it's a little bit kind of backwards with regards to that. So very good for qualitative, maybe not so great for quantitative, unless you're going to spend a significant amount of time of actually training them how to use it. But it is there, and it is an option. And then we come on to the fun bit, or the bit that I quite like about toxicology, because before this point, all you've done is kind of sample analysis, which you could do in other modules. It's not, you know, specific entirely to toxicology. You've looked at linear regression, etc. Again, probably not specific to your toxicology module. It's about the actual data interpretation itself. So it's about, you've got all these different concentrations, especially in postmortem toxicology, where you might have had a death that came from multiple drug use, because let's face it, people don't tend to just abuse the one drug. And it's about that kind of critical thinking in the grey that I really want to emphasise to my students, and to get them thinking about things really critically. So what I use is this website called autopsyfiles.org. Now, I don't know why this website exists. I'm not entirely comfortable with the fact that this website exists, but it is actually quite a good teaching resource. And it does have a whole load of celebrity autopsy reports. If you are wanting to look at the celebrity autopsy reports, access these via the sidebar, because you'll get a more comprehensive list rather than the links underneath the autopsyfiles.org at the top. I don't know why the reason for that is, but you will get some, you know, big hitters, I guess, in this website. So what I do when I go into autopsyfiles.org previously is I have pulled autopsy reports where there is actual toxicological information in them. Not every single person on autopsyfiles.org is going to have toxicological data there. They, you know, they've got gunshot wounds, etc., rather than just, you know, our straight drug overdoses. So what I do is I pull the big hitters, so somebody like Michael Jackson, Carrie Fisher, she's there, Whitney Houston's there, and I'll redact all of their names and all of the information. Now, depending on whether I'm teaching to level 6 or level 7 will depend how much information I give them, because some of these autopsy files are, you know, pages upon pages upon pages. So if it's level 6, I'll probably just pull out, you know, the case history, how they were found, etc., the little scribbles of the pathologist on the little body, and what is most likely going to be some sort of NMS or Los Angeles toxicological report in there as well. So they'll have what they screened for and what they identified. I'll then split the students into groups. Now, last year we did that virtually, we did it through Teams, and that's, you know, relatively easy to do. You can upload your files into Teams, or you can have them previously on like your LMS system. And then what I ask them to do is to summarise the cases that they've got, okay, or summarise the case that they've got for when they come back to the main cohort. So I want them looking at what drugs did they find, what drugs did the person actually have on them at the time in terms of prescription meds, what samples did they take, did they find anything unusual at postmortem? So that's somebody like Carrie Fisher or Whitney Houston, who both had holes in the septums of their noses, for example. Again, getting them to think about tolerance and how long somebody's been abusing certain drugs. And then I also get them to identify similarities between cases. So we have Whitney Houston, and we also have Bobby Christina Brown, and they died in extremely similar circumstances. And what I try to hit home with the students is that, you know, the media do such a good job of making us think that drug users are a certain specific aspect of our society, and how we should speak to them, and how we should behave to them, etc. And I want them to just kind of identify the fact that actually people that do have substance misuse problems, it isn't just, you know, what the media portray. It's very difficult to break this cycle, and I think that this case, because of the similarities between, you know, mother and daughter and the way that they died, and obviously we know that, you know, in this situation money wasn't necessarily an issue. If they struggle to break the cycle of drug abuse, then, you know, I guess you can kind of say that your average Joe is also going to struggle. And then at the end, because I've done this huge big soapbox of how we need to be nicer to people that are abusing drugs, etc., and see it as a health issue, I then ask them if they can guess actually who they've got. And the students really like that, because they really like the fact that it's something that they can relate to as well. And again, it just makes it a little bit more fun after I've, you know, been on my soapbox for a bit. So when we went into lockdown in March, I was in the middle of running this module, and so with our exam questions, we still had exams. So this is an example exam question that we asked that wasn't particularly well answered, actually. And so all of our exams are now going to be open book, and it's about showing an application of knowledge. So for example, in the first question, which is just a simple Widmark calculation, we're asking them to know any assumptions made during their calculations. So there's not a specific one size fits all answer for this. It depends, you know, when are they going to take their point of elimination? Is it going to be at 9 p.m? Is it going to be at 11 p.m, etc.? So that was quite a good question, because well, I guess it wasn't a good question because a lot of them couldn't really answer it particularly well, but it meant that our exam marks stayed on par with what we would have expected, regardless of COVID, which was, I guess, nice. And then again, it's all about asking them about their application of knowledge and their reasoning. So, you know, what samples are you taking? Why are you taking these samples? What factors are you taking into consideration, rather than just straight data interpretation or straight data handling. They do get a data handling quantitative question as well. That would be their final question, but we were making sure that it's not just like all the marks are based on that as well. So in terms of your toxicological additional resources, there is plenty of vendor videos out there. There's things on YouTube, so like Agilent, for example, have a whole stream of resources. What I would say though is that some of these seem quite dated, you know, they seem as if they have been recorded in maybe like the 80s, 90s, and actually if we could have some more up-to-date videos, I think that would be kind of more useful for some of us, especially for engaging the students. We're also, a lot of us are getting most likely bombarded with different webinar invitations for different vendors. And again, these are things that we can share with our students to say, you know, you should go and have a look at this, or this is going to show this piece of instrumentation in use, or what it can do, etc. Getting actual cases is really easy for us in terms of what's out there. So you can head to like old conference proceedings. So for example, the American Academy, all of their previous proceedings are all available online. They've all been digitized. So again, you can provide them with real life samples and or real life cases, and redact what samples they took, and, you know, say to them, what samples would you be selecting and what would you be looking for? Well, here's what they actually did. And again, you can look at, there's plenty of publications for case reports. And what I also quite like to do is that when I'm looking at case reports for my students, I will pull out medical case reports as well, where they've said that, you know, somebody has had these different effects due to toxicology and due to like the drugs that they've taken. But there's never any actual toxicology in them. Medical reports and medical publications are so bad for that. And hopefully, again, I'll get on my soapbox and try and make sure that if any of them do end up in hospitals, if they're publishing based on any interesting drug cases, that they actually do the talks for them. That would be great. And you can also ask them to create kind of standard operating procedures themselves rather than provide them. And again, the United Chemical Technologies, they have a manual that has thousands of different applications for their solid phase extraction products to provide them as a starting point. yeah, so that's again another good thing for them to rely on. So yeah, hopefully that kind of made a bit of sense. And yeah, if you've got any questions, that would be great.
Oh wow, Lorna, that was really fantastic. You actually answered some of my questions that I had already. One of them was about the standard operating procedures, because I thought that was brilliant how you've embedded that in your module. And you've already answered that because you said you try and get the students to write their own. But I wondered if you'd consider translating that to other modules that you teach on, you know, embedding quality procedures.
Yeah, so I think quality procedures are quite an important thing for us to embed, regardless of what the module is. But it's that kind of slow transition to what you're starting off with. I mean, the way I say it to students is it's almost kind of like being on Great British Bake Off when you're doing your signature. You start off with all of the instructions at the beginning when you're just new to the lab, and then you, by the end of your time, it should be very kind of go and run a sample, go and do this. So I don't know what it is about putting something in standard operating procedure format that students, I don't know whether it's just it looks more official, but they just don't seem to take the information as much, or at least I found that anyway, which I find bizarre because it's effectively just an instruction list. But yeah, we do try and embed it elsewhere where possible and get them thinking about it and getting them thinking about critiquing things, especially in light of ISO 17020 and ISO 17025 as well.
Absolutely. And another interesting thing that I really like about the way that you applied the toxicology subject to your students is how you've contextualized it. So you actually get them to investigate actual cases, and you know that you have a 3-level approach, and you mentioned the 3rd level, which was the flipped approach, and I thought this was really refreshing how you get them to analyze it from the defense perspective. So they're in effect looking at a different proposition. So I thought that's really amazing the way that you do that as well.
Yeah, and it allows you as well to find out who's really struggling in terms of who actually fully understands what you're teaching and who's not, because being able to write a report is one thing, but being able to actually find flaws in something else, I think, is an entirely different skill. So and that again is something that we're bringing into more modules this year because of how we're having to flip. So for example, the fire analysis module, it will have pre-recognition type stuff in it this year, and that should hopefully mean that next trimester when they come to me they're slightly better prepared, but it also means that when they come to do their crime scene to court module, they'll know what they're looking for in their own witness statements as well. They've got that kind of additional reasoning, I guess.
Yeah, and they've got this questioning attitude. I think that you provide such an interesting context, and like Felicity's talk, both the talks today have included the importance of data handling, you know, how you get your students to analyse the data as well. So I think that's yeah, and there's so many good tips for people, other educators, on how to, you know, access these online resources. So fantastic. Do you have any other questions, Rachel, that have come in through from the audience?
No, we haven't had any questions, but we've got a good number of attendees for today, which is really good. And we appreciate that it's right in the middle of teaching, etc. But I did also have a question for Lorna around kind of how are you, I know you mentioned the marking. I just wondered how you were assessing and what the mark scheme looks like for the SOPs or the presentations, the case summaries that you get them to do.
So we don't mark them for the presentations. We just do that as part of a kind of online learning system, or like just a normal class. Just because again, it's covering so many bases and it's kind of tying the entire module together. So that's one of the very last things that I'll do, because it also acts as quite a good kind of revision aid thing. But in terms of the marking scheme for their lab reports, it's quite a basic lab report kind of marking scheme that we're asking them to do, but I think it's just that we're asking them to go that step further. So instead of it just being a basic lab report where it's, you know, these are the methods. I don't really care about the method section. I care about the fact that the case that they get in terms of toxicology will have acetaminophen, it will have alcohol, and it will have cocaine. And it's the fact that they can link the two of the alcohol and the cocaine, and then say that they really should be testing for cocaethylene, etc., that we're looking for from them, rather than just, we found these drugs. Well, that doesn't tell me anything.
Absolutely, yeah, we very much try and focus on the same aspect. It's, you know, what do the results mean, you know, what do those results mean in the context of the case, what things did you expect there to be, what things, what interpretations might you make that might help the investigative team, or that might provide information for the defence, etc. Absolutely.
Yes. And finding the data is generally quite easy for us, because especially I know that a lot of us are now allowed to at least visit our campuses. We're allowed to be there for a short period of time, and we've ran all these samples, you know, for years and years and years. So being able to at least pull the data and either give them a batch file and say, go through this and process it and see if, you know, it's within your validation parameters. For example, if you're looking at your quality controls, does it fit in with SWIG talks, that kind of thing, is you're kind of asking them to be a bit more realistic, I guess, because, you know, you're trying to prepare them for potentially being reporting scientists rather than just being straight lab technicians, I guess.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, you know, whilst many people think that the practical skills are, you know, the most important around doing the degree, actually it isn't. You know, that's, you know, one of the relatively lower level aspects of what they're learning and what we're trying to teach, and it's actually that much more deeper understanding the complexity, the issues that whether things sort of react with each other, false positives, false negatives, and all of that complication around the particular case is really where the depth and that true understanding comes out. And absolutely.